Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the exclusive virtual session of People Matters Tech HR Singapore 2022. This virtual stream is especially for those of you who can't join us in the physical event today. While it's not quite the same, we hope that we have enough exciting sessions lined up that tuning in will not take away anything from our Tech HR experience. Also, to help to recreate some of that conference buzz, we're running a leaderboard. Post on social media, engage with the events, share your insights, take some screenshots, note down some quotes, and post it on LinkedIn or Instagram with the hashtag TechHRSG. We've got some prizes going for the best contributors on each channel. Quantity and quality both count, so don't just post for every single thing. Post something cool. Get a nice quote, get some insights, get some thoughts. Maybe you could be a LinkedIn blogger or Insta artist of the day and win some exciting prizes. Yes, we have prizes for you. Now, let's move on to our main agenda. For today's first session, we are going to be joined by Professor Daniel Kahneman, Professor of Psychology and Public Affairs from Princeton University. If you don't know who Daniel Kahneman is, please go out and pick up a copy of his book, Thinking, Fast and Slow. Yes, that book. So Professor Kahneman, for those who have read his work, he's a psychologist and economist. He focuses on the psychology of judgment and decision-making as well as behavioural economics, and he's a Nobel Prize winner in economic sciences. A lot of his work focuses on the assumption of human rationality in modern economic theory. What do you think about that? Post something on LinkedIn or Instagram if you feel like sharing some thoughts. Introducing Professor Kahneman. Welcome, Daniel. It's a pleasure to host you today at Tech HR Singapore. Now, to facilitate today's session, we're bringing in Esther Martinez, CEO and editor of Chief of People Matters. Welcome, Esther. Wonderful to have both of you here today. And over to you, Esther.
Very warm welcome, everyone, for our exclusive session on decision making in the world of noise. Surely we could not have wished for a better guest today on the topic to join us for People Matters Tech HR Singapore than Professor Daniel Kahneman himself. So very warm welcome, Professor Kahneman, to the event.
My pleasure to be with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And with your permission, I will call you Daniel throughout the conversation. Comfortable?
Yes, fine.
Awesome.
People call me
Wonderful.
Danny, but many people think that's a little too informal, so
right.
Whatever.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. So Professor Daniel Kahneman needs no introduction for all of you. As you know, he's professor psychology emeritus at Princeton University, and he's also the Nobel Prize winner in economic science, celebrated psychologist and behavioral economist, and co-author of many books that we all have had the opportunity to read. So today, Daniel, we're going to be talking about flaws in human judgment. We're going to be talking about noise and the difference between noise and bias, specifically connecting it to the new book that you recently published, and specifically focusing a little bit more on the human judgment when it comes to making decisions about people, which is really our area of focus, not only as a business leaders, but also as HR professionals. So let me start with the first question, which is related to the crucial flaws of human judgment. As business leaders, as people leaders, as HR professionals, we need to make decisions all the time. And you have really studied what are those crucial flaws of human judgment. Tell us a little bit more about what are those and how we can overcome them.
Oh, well, this is a big topic. There are many flaws in human judgment, and the problem of how to overcome them is not simple at all. One important classification that I've been concerned with in recent years is the distinction between two types of flaws, biases versus noise. And then there are different kinds of bias. There is the kind of bias that many people think of, which is discrimination against groups or against gender. That's one kind of bias. I've spent most of my career working on another class of biases, which are cognitive biases, which is just from, those are, as it were, side effects from the wonderful way in which our mind works. The side effects are some characteristic mistakes. So there is a very rich topic of biases, and there is a newer topic of noise, which is the differences among people and the variability within individual in the kind of judgment that people make. Uh, as for remedies, that is too broad a question. You'll have to be more specific.
All right, so let's go a little deeper, and hopefully we'll find some opportunities for us to share some of those solutions. So you talked about biases and the two types of biases, and you talk about noise. So give us, if you could, some examples of these three clusters for us to
Well,
kind of understand a little bit more.
I mean, the easiest one, of course, and the one that people are most concerned with is bias against groups or bias
Yeah,
in favor of some groups. And this is that the judgment of people, and that can be an honest judgment of people, is biased in the sense that they are more likely to find flaws or to find virtues in particular individual. They're predisposed, and we call that prejustice in the sense of prejudgment. So there is prejud prejudgments are very common and quite important. That's not been my area of expertise, and the examples are easy to come by.
yeah,
An example of cognitive biases, well, there are many, but perhaps a very important one is overconfidence. That is, that when people make a judgment, it is difficult for them to imagine how that judgment could be wrong. And people have exaggerated confidence in their judgment. This is a major bias, and it shows up everywhere, and it shows up certainly in all matters related to judgments of other human beings. So this is the field that you're talking about. And so that is one, which is really that we have a tendency to see things in a particular way, and the particular vision that we have inhibits other possibilities. So there's a failure of imagination. It's a failure of, it's a difficulty in seeing how my judgment could be different, and it's associated with the difficulty in seeing how your judgment could be different from mine. And then noise is is in general undesirable variability in judgments. And so what we find is that the same individuals, given the same question on different occasions, will make different responses. And that reflects their mood or reflects the momentary context or reflects the question that they just answered. So that is variability within a person, and there is a fair amount of that. Then there is variability across people, and there is a huge amount of between persons variability, much more than I think most people realize, and much more than I had personally expected. I've been studying this for less than 10 years, but I keep being surprised by the degree to which people could disagree on judgment that would appear to be obvious. So those are the three kinds of flaws.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniel, for that. So when it comes to humans' judgments or people-related judgments, which is the one that comes on our way more, the cognitive biases or the noise? What would be most
Well,
worrisome on that front?
Well, it's a difficult question because actually there have been very few systematic studies that allow one to compare the effects of noise to the effects of bias. But
Yeah.
my guess is that in the operation of systems, of organizations, noise may be a more important factor than bias. In that there is so much variability across people. So perhaps I should give you an example of noise because
I would
all of
love to.
this is very abstract. So, well, there are I'll give you an example from the field of insurance, and we'll talk later about examples in the domain of judgments about people. But the first example that called my attention to the issue of noise was a study of underwriters in an insurance company, who were, and we created an experiment in which we showed them quite realistic cases, and they had to put a dollar value on these cases. And then we asked executives a question that I could ask you or your audience as well, because I think I know the answer that people are likely to give. And the question is this: if you take two underwriters at random and you look at the difference between them in percentages of the size of the judgment that they make, what difference do you expect? And it turns out that uh, there is a number that people expect, and the number is about 10% or 15%. 10% looks like a reasonable discrepancy between judgments of the same object by different people. But in that particular situation of the underwriters, the average difference was actually 50%, 50, 5 times larger than most people would expect. And that has really been confirmed in a variety of topics. For example, uh, in evaluating investments by venture capitalists. It's been verified among judges determining sentences for the same crime. There's a lot of variability and a lot of noise. And there is, of course, a lot of noise in HR. There is noise in evaluating candidates, great deal of noise, and there is perhaps even more noise in evaluating workers. It turns out that the same worker can get very different evaluations of their work by peers and by superiors, and different superiors will give very different judgments. So noise is noise is a big deal.
So as you're sharing the difference between cognitive bias and noise, and we'll stay with noise for a little bit more. And you've given these examples outside of the field of HR, but beautiful example for us to connect how that happens in interviewing candidates and also even assessing performance within the organization. What are some of the solutions in your book? You talk about structured approaches or structured interviews or structure, creating some ways for us to be aware of this noise. Tell us a little bit more.
Well, actually, one of the best studied examples of how to control noise and how to reduce noise is from the field of interviewing.
Yeah.
And that played a very important role in our thinking about solutions to the problems of
Awesome.
noise. Uh, it turns out that there are those two broad categories of interviews: the unstructured interview, which is the normal way that people interview candidates. They just talk with them, and they try to draw them out, and they try to form an impression of who the person is that they might be hiring. And that's the unstructured interview. A structured interview is planned in advance. It is designed in advance. It is supposed to cover certain topics, and it is supposed to address specific dimensions of the candidate and to assign a score to specific dimensions, attributes of the candidate, and to score and to do that in sequence so that you deal with one topic and you stop and you put a score for that topic, be it reliability or experience or sociability or whatever. You take one attribute, you interview about it, you ask questions about it, and you score it. And you try to delay global judgment until you've collected all the information. And that turns out to be very important, because the weakness in unstructured interviews is that interviewers tend to jump to conclusions. we form impressions of other people very quickly, and and we an impression that we have formed tends to bias everything in the way we interpret new information that we receive about the person. So I've read somewhere an estimate that interviewers who interview candidates, they spend the first 2 or 3 minutes of the interview forming an impression, and the rest of the interview is spent mostly in justifying their impression. That is, people don't try to refute their impressions, they try to confirm them. And and the intuitive immediate judgment is really a major source of problems in many judgments. And our general advice on this is not to do without intuition, but to delay intuition. Delay intuition within an interview and delay intuition in general when you're making a judgment.
And I'm going to come to this delay intuition in a minute, but let me stay with this structured approach. Again, going back to the field of human resources, when we are doing it with interviews, because we don't know the candidate, it may be a lot of self-discipline, but yet possible. But when we're doing it with other people-related processes like promotion or career advancement, how do we delay intuition when you already have, at the end of the day, a lot of information about the person?
Well, that is really quite difficult, and the answer is really keeping track and keeping records. I think there is probably no other answer. That is, when you pass a judgment, you have a general impression, but evidence would be very useful. And so having a practice of making notes about salient events in the performance of an individual, good or bad, and looking at those notes when you're doing the final evaluation, that is probably a very good way to try to combat this intuitive judgment. You may really discover that you have an impression that is very positive, but that actually there have been many problems with this individual over time. You just happen to like this individual, or you happen to dislike this individual, and actually, in terms of performance, the performance has been flawless. So, those are things that you can discover by questioning yourself. And this is something that people do not like to do, they're not very good at it, and they rarely do it.
So just to encourage everyone to really be serious about questioning and challenging, what is some of the price that we pay? And of course, you can't put a number to it, but what is really the problems that these noise creates in decision making, and why is it so serious? Why is it so
Well,
important?
uh, in the context of hiring, it's very obvious. It's whether you hire the better person or you don't. And it turns out that very frequently we don't. That
Yeah.
is, the validity, the correlation between predictions and actual performance is quite low. It should be low in the sense that performance is to a large degree unpredictable. That is, how an individual will perform on the job depends on the context, on whether they are liked by their superior, on whether they have supportive peers. That cannot be predicted in advance usually. But to some extent, there is prediction, there is predictability, and people do not achieve the accuracy that they could achieve if they work better. And that we know because we know that objective scoring of candidates actually outperforms most subjective judgments. That's the main finding, I think, the most consistent finding in judgments about human beings is that very simple formulas typically achieve better results and more accurate results than people do.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, Daniel, for that. So going back, you were talking about intuition, and it's not about not. You said something very beautiful. You said we delay intuition. We don't.
Yeah,
What's
we
the word?
don't try to do without it, but try to delay it.
So tell us more
People
about that.
people need intuition. I mean, intuition, I associate, there are many aspects to intuition, but one of them is a sense of confidence that you achieve, that you have, that you understand the situation, that you understand an individual. And I think it's very important that to achieve that sense of confidence in the end and of closure in a judgment. But to achieve it too early is extremely dangerous, because to achieve it too early means that you're no longer collecting information, that you're collecting much too little information. Then you stop collecting and you start justifying. And that means that somebody would start elsewhere could get to a very different point. So that's one of the problems with intuition. But I really think that intuition, with all its flaws, in the first place, in some cases, intuition is wonderful. So I don't want to say that intuition is always wrong. Uh, and and in many cases, it is necessary, even if it is not wonderful. But it is wonderful when people get feedback on the quality of their judgments, and when they get immediate feedback on the quality of their judgment. And from that point of view, uh, people who do hiring are in a very unfortunate situation, because actually they do not get feedback. So the true expertise requires feedback. Without feedback, you develop a subjective sense of expertise. You think you are getting much better at making judgments or at understanding people, but in fact, you're not. In fact, the confidence that develops in the absence of feedback is that what happens is, with experience, you become more consistent in your judgments. You start agreeing with yourself.
So
And
that
when you agree with yourself, that makes you confident, as if you had the truth. But in fact, you're only agreeing with yourself. You're not necessarily agreeing with objective reality.
so is that what creates that cognitive bias that you were talking to us in the beginning of the conversation?
Oh, it certainly is closely related. That this is one of the ways in which people become overconfident is, and we've seen that in professions where there is no feedback. For example, underwriters in insurance company uh, are in the same position as people who do hiring. They don't get feedback, and yet they become increasingly confident. So, how do they become increasingly confident? And they become increasingly confident because they develop their own personal habits of how to make judgments, and they become consistent in those habits. And uh, that's, that makes people very confident with no justification.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniel, for that. So this year's theme for TechHR is rethinking what's possible, and one of the reasons why we wanted you to be part of this agenda is specifically because of your work that you've done with noise and how professionals in the HR space can benefit from it. So, what will be if you were to share with them? How can they rethink what's possible to increase or help organizations to make better people-related decisions? What will be your word of advice to all our audience today?
I think my first advice would be to measure noise, to study and ask the question, do we have noise in our system, in our judgment system? So, for example, uh, in hiring candidates, there are many ways in which noise can enter. But first of all, you want to know if different people would reach the same conclusions. So by doing systematic studies in which several people interview the same candidate, or several people see the same film of a candidate being interviewed, you can see how much discrepancy there is. That, I think, is the first thing to be done, because very likely you're going to find that there is more noise than you think. And then
Yeah.
you will be motivated to improve judgment so as to reduce the noise. In terms of reducing the noise, there are some procedures that are in place, some in some cases. And for example, in many situations, you can have case conferences. So you have a discussion of a particular case and how that case should be evaluated. And case conferences are very useful as a noise reduction tool, especially if one condition is met, which is rarely met. And that condition is to have people who are exposed to a particular case, making judgments about a particular case, to have them make their judgments independently of each other, because people influence each other very quickly and people sense where the sentiment of the group is. And so if you allow people to talk among themselves before producing their judgment, you are going to observe a lot less noise than actually exists. That is, the first people to speak are going to have a very large effect. Other people are going to converge to those who speak first, and so on. So having what we call those noise audits, which is to examine how much noise there is, that requires putting people in front of facing people with problems and having them deal with those problems without consulting each other to measure the amount of noise. Once you've measured the amount of noise and you've convinced yourself you have a problem, then you can carry on, and then you should carry on the case conferences as I described them. And then there is room for an intelligent discussion of, when there is noise, why do we differ so much? What did we, different individuals, we were looking at the same interview, or looking at the same case, and what we saw very different things. What did we see? And just establishing that variability is, I think, very useful. And then trying to ask, well, what is the best way to proceed is the next question. And here there is advice that can be given, which is try to make your judgment based not on impressions, but on objective facts. So the more you can base a judgment on objective facts, the less noise there will be. The more it is done by personal impressions and by intuitive judgments of individuals, the more noise there will be.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And what I love about your advice is that you're able to bring, some objective and process oriented, but you've added also this importance of dialogue and the importance of discovering. And that in itself creates that culture of realizing that actually we see things differently, and that helps us probably keep each other on our own toes
Yes.
to question each other, right? So it's not just a mathematical thing,
To
it's also
question
the dialogue.
ourselves as well as each other. Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniel, for being with us. And I'm going to ask you just last final question, which is a little more personal, with your permission. Because when we think about rethinking what's possible, and you are somebody who has rethink what's possible multiple times in your career, in your profession, and you've been somebody who's always rethought what's possible. So how do you, as Daniel Kahneman, rethink what's possible? What's your mantra to rethink what's possible for yourself?
It's a matter of character. That's I'm in some sense I'm unusual in one way, I think, which is that I enjoy changing my mind. And because when I change my mind, that's when I have the feeling that I have learned something that I didn't know before. So it makes me very difficult to collaborate with. My collaborators get quite impatient with me because I make a proposal that I'm very confident in, and then I say, oh, I don't believe this anymore. Let's try something else. So that's that's been, my luck or lack of luck has been to have that characteristic of being. It's not that I'm underconfident, I'm overconfident, but I'm overconfident every time, but I keep changing my mind. And that mitigates the effects of overconfidence.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. And you're talking about luck or not luck, but it's surely been our luck of all our, all your readers, all people who follow your work. It's surely been our luck that you have this gift and being able to produce so amazing work.
Well, thank you.
Wonderful. So thank you so much for staying with us for this conversation. With us, Professor Daniel Kahneman, psychology emeritus at Princeton University, Nobel Prize winner of social economics. It's been a privilege to have you with us. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
That was amazing. I'm sure everyone got as many fantastic insights as I did. Do bring back some of these to your organization, to your friends, share them with your family, post them on LinkedIn and Instagram. If you took a screenshot, don't hesitate to Photoshop yourself into it and post it as well. Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you so much, Esther, for this fantastic discussion. Now, up next in the exclusive virtual agenda of TechHR Singapore, we're bringing you a mega keynote on borderless talent. This is quite a big issue these days, yeah? To speak for us with us next, we have Rick Hamill, founder and CEO of Atlas. Atlas, for those who aren't familiar with the name, is the world's largest employer of record. And Rick has quite a bit of expertise in this issue of how to hire across borders, how to connect with teams, and how to engage them. He'll be presenting a keynote on the connection and collaboration conundrum. See you in the next session.